The first time my wife pulled into our quiet cul-de-sac with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and her boots still caked with desert dust, I thought the worst was behind us, that we had finally earned the right to live in peace like everyone else on that street, with the perfect lawns and overzealous mailbox decorations. But what I didn't expect was that her presence alone, the way she walked with confidence, scanned every yard like a security sweep, and barely flinched when a car backfired, would rattle the brittle little world of the woman 3 houses down more than any music, fence paint, or trash bin timing violation ever could. Her name was Deborah, but she went by Karen not just because she fit the stereotype with surgical precision, but because she wore the name like armor, proudly introducing herself to new residents as the real heart of this HOA, which was code for "I run everything and expect you to play along." When I moved in alone, she mostly ignored me a few passive-aggressive notes about weeds and a comment at the block party about how bachelor houses attract noise, but nothing serious until my wife came home. Captain. Decorated. Combat-tested. Proudly wearing her uniform when she stepped out of that truck, and waved to the neighbors with a tired smile that said she'd seen worse than anything Ridgewood Hills could throw at her. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle. A car parked too close to the curb suddenly got a citation. Our mailbox didn't match HOA color standards, even though I'd used the same supplier as everyone else. Then came the noise complaints filed at times when no one was home, or when my wife was just working out in the backyard gym we'd built together, using the same punching bag she used on deployment. Karen didn't like her. That much was clear. Maybe it was the way my wife stood tall, or maybe it was the fact that someone like her, a woman of color, no less commanded respect without asking. But Karen's real line-crossing moment came 3 weeks later, the day she saw my wife in workout gear unloading groceries, and apparently decided she didn't belong. I was at work when the call came in. Dispatch flagged it. Not because it was high priority, but because one of the newer operators recognized my address and thought I should hear it before someone made a mistake. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person." Karen's voice crackled through the recording, smug and self-righteous. "There's a woman unloading things into the house at 427. She looks aggressive. Military, I think. Possibly stolen valor. I don't feel safe." That last sentence is what stuck with me. I don't feel safe. Not because of a crime. Not because of a threat. But because my wife had muscles, wore boots, and walked like someone who'd survived hell, which...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Wore boots, and walked like someone who'd survived hell, which, ironically, she had. I rushed home before patrol arrived, but it was too late. 2 squad cars were already on the street, lights on but no sirens. And my wife stood calmly at the bottom of our driveway, arms crossed, grocery bags still in the trunk, while Karen stood across the lawn, arms flailing, giving some kind of performance about how this neighborhood has standards, and we have to be vigilant. One of the officers, young guy, clearly new, approached my wife and asked for ID, clearly uncomfortable. She didn't hesitate. She pulled out her wallet, flipped it open, and handed him her military ID card, the one with the eagle crest, her rank, and years of service etched into it like steel. The officer looked at it, blinked, looked at her again, then turned to Karen and said something I will never forget. "Ma'am, you just called law enforcement on a decorated officer of the United States Army. That's not just embarrassing, that's borderline harassment." Karen's face went pale, not just pale, but ghost white, like someone had unplugged her from reality. She tried to backpedal, muttering about just being careful and anyone could buy camo, but the damage was done. The other officer, recognizing me, gave me a quiet nod and mouthed, "Got this," before turning to de-escalate Karen's latest meltdown. My wife didn't flinch. She didn't yell, didn't demand anything. She just walked back to the truck, grabbed the rest of the groceries, and walked past the whole mess like it didn't deserve her attention, because it didn't. That night, we sat on the back deck, drinking cheap beer and watching the sunset, and she laughed a short, tired laugh that I hadn't heard in months. "Of all the battles I've fought," she said, "I didn't think a suburban lawn general would be the one to try and take me out." We clinked bottles and let it go, at least for that night. But inside, I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't stop when they're proven wrong. They double down. And when they feel power slipping away, they do something even more dangerous. They try to rewrite the rules. True to form, Karen didn't take her public embarrassment as a sign to back down. She took it as a challenge, a personal vendetta, like my wife's existence in our neighborhood had somehow upended her sense of control. And what followed wasn't loud, but calculated, the kind of quiet sabotage people like her excel at, starting with letters, unsigned but typed, placed inside our mailbox in unmarked envelopes, accusing us of violating HOA, decorum, of conducting military activity from our backyard because of the gym equipment, of intimidating other residents with overbearing body language and unregistered military gear, as if the old flag folded in a baram. Shadowbox on our front shelf was some kind of threat rather than a memory of someone my wife served beside who didn't make it back. She even went as far as filing a complaint with the HOA board, not just about our property, but about my wife's presence being unsettling to children, a line so offensive it nearly got her thrown out of the meeting by the treasurer, who was a retired Navy nurse and knew exactly what it meant to serve cabal. Word spread quickly after that, and while a few of Karen's loyal lapdogs on the board whispered support, the rest of the neighborhood started seeing her for what she was, not just a stickler, but a danger to the peace she claimed Carr to protect. Our neighbors, who'd once waved cautiously from their driveways, started crossing the street to say hello, bringing baked goods, offering help, some even apologizing for not speaking up sooner. We didn't need their pity, but the shift was noticeable. And Karen...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Need their pity, but the shift was noticeable. And Karen noticed it too. Her porch flags stopped changing, her social media posts grew more erratic, and then, one day, a for sale by owner sign appeared in front of her perfectly trimmed hedge. But she didn't sell. Not yet. She was trying to bait us, to make us think she was leaving while she prepared her next move. And that move came during the HOA quarterly audit, when a sudden compliance inspection was ordered for our house, citing irregularities in landscaping, equipment visibility, and unspecified guest activity, all of which were code for. Karen wanted one last swing. But what she didn't know was that my wife had already gone through the HOA charter line by line, flagging every clause, highlighting every loophole, and documenting every time Karen had overstepped her authority, so when the inspectors arrived clipboard in hand, forced smiles in place, we invited them in, offered them water, walked them through every inch of our property, and presented a printed folder of preemptive compliance certifications, photos, timestamps, and neighbor witness statements that not only shut down their inspection, put them on the defensive, and by the time they left, they were apologizing to us. Karen didn't take that well, and she made one final mistake. She tried to file a formal complaint with my wife's unit, claiming unbecoming conduct in civilian life, which would have been serious if any of it were remotely true. But instead of hiding, my wife handed the letter directly to her commanding officer, who not only dismissed it outright, but called Karen's actions defamatory and initiated a formal civilian harassment review, the result of which, along with the growing HOA frustration, finally forced Karen to resign from her unofficial leadership role. Her for sale sign went back up, this time listed through an actual realtor, and we didn't throw a party, didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. We just kept living, walking the dog, tending the lawn, training in the backyard, knowing full well that her kind of noise only gets quieter when you don't feed it. The day she left, the moving truck came early, and she didn't look at us, not once, but her husband, who had always looked like he regretted marrying a war he never signed up for, gave us a tired, grateful nod, the kind that says, "Thank you for surviving her," And as the truck rolled away, my wife took a deep breath, turned to me, and said, "You think the next one's going to be quieter?" I smiled, kissed her forehead, and replied, "If not, we'll be ready." Because the truth is, we didn't pick that neighborhood to prove anything, we picked it to heal, to rest, to live. But when you put a warrior in a peaceful place, they don't bring war with them, they bring the calm after the fight. And that, more than anything, is what scared Karen the most. We thought her departure would be the end of it, that the neighborhood would settle into a quiet, post-Karen calm, where people trimmed their hedges without fear of citation, and kids could ride their bikes without getting reported for loitering. But as anyone who's dealt with an HOA power vacuum knows, when one tyrant leaves, there's always another volunteer ready to fill the throne, and in Ridgewood Hills, that came in the form of Brian Kessler, a man with an obsession for bylaws, a Bluetooth headset he never took off, and the kind of nervous energy that made you think he'd memorized the license plates of every car on the street by heart. He didn't come in swinging the way Karen had, though no, Brian was slicker, more corporate, more spreadsheet than spectacle, and at first, it felt like an improvement. But when my wife and I returned from a short trip to see her family out of state, and found a note taped to our door citing us for unauthorized storage of tactical equipment in public view, we knew Brian wasn't going to be any better. He was just going to be quieter about it. The so-called tactical equipment. A standard-issue rucksack my wife had left in the garage while unloading, zipped shut, no weapons, no markings, nothing anyone with sense would find threatening. But apparently, Brian, who had recently appointed himself safety liaison of the HOA, decided it violated community image guidelines, even though said guidelines were vague enough to apply to anything he didn't like. I tried the polite route first, emailed him a short message reminding him that HOA rules require board consensus before individual enforcement actions. But I got back a cold auto-response and a forwarded PDF of outdated guidelines from 2017. One Karen herself had once tried to push before being shut down by the actual legal committee. We ignored it, at first until the next week, when we received a formal warning letter in the mail threatening daily fines if the military presence on our property wasn't appropriately CAFRAS. Concealed from community view, a phrase so loaded and targeted it practically dripped with the same passive-aggressive bias Karen had been famous for. This time, though, my wife wasn't interested in being quiet. She drafted a formal complaint, filed it with the county housing authority, attached photos, timestamps, and a scanned copy of her active military credentials, and then posted the entire exchange in the neighborhood group chat with the caption, "Just wondering how a legally deployed officer becomes a community violation. Thoughts?" The thread exploded. Dozens of neighbors chimed in, some furious, others stunned, many saying they had also received random notes and threats from Brian, but hadn't said anything out of fear of retaliation. Within 24 hours, an emergency HOA meeting was called, and we attended not to start a fight, but to finish a pattern, because this wasn't just about us. It was about people like Brian and Karen who built thrones out of paperwork and power plays, who turned...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Brian and Karen who built thrones out of paperwork and power plays, who turned quiet communities into battlegrounds for their insecurities. I let my wife speak, because it was her story, her name that had been targeted, her life that had been diminished to a presence, and when she stood up, full uniform, crisp collar, ribbons gleaming, and calmly recited the chain of events to a packed room of stunned homeowners, something shifted. Not just in the room, but in the fabric of that neighborhood, because for once, the lie of concern and regulation couldn't cover up the truth, and Brian, who had until then been pacing near the back with a cutboard and his ever-present Bluetooth, went pale in the same way Karen had when she first saw that military ID, muttering about miscommunications and procedural calm. Misunderstandings. But no one was buying it. The board voted 5-0 to censure him, temporarily suspend all compliance actions initiated in his name, and launch a full review of HOA procedures regarding discrimination, enforcement, and the bar. Limits of community authority. It was a small win, but a loud one, And the aftermath was even more telling. Neighbors started organizing monthly barbecues, not run by the HOA, but by the residents themselves, and we were asked to co-host. The first one, people brought dishes, lawn chairs, stories, and for the first time, it felt like a real neighborhood, not a gated kingdom run by clipboard royalty, but a living, breathing community made of people who had learned, maybe the hard way, that silence favors the petty, and that good people have to speak up before things rot from within. My wife became something of a local legend, not because she wore the uniform, but because she never let the uniform define her power. It was her composure, her refusal to be bullied, her grace under pressure that made people rally. And when Brian finally resigned a month later, citing personal reasons, the street cheered quietly in their own ways. More smiles, more waving, fewer flyers taped to doors in the dead of night. We got letters, thank you cards, even a bottle of wine from an older couple who said they'd been afraid to install a flagpole because of past harassment. My wife helped them raise that flag one Saturday morning while the Bacchanals whole block watched. And when it unfurled in the breeze, bright and defiant, I realized something important. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the resistance to oppression in all its subtle forms. It's standing still when someone tries to push you out of your own space and saying, "Not today, not here, and definitely not to her." Karen may have left, and Brian may have folded, but the impact they had reminded us why vigilance matters not just with laws or boundaries, but with the way we see each other, treat each other, and protect the spaces crews we call home. So we kept walking the block, kept waving, kept building not for the sake of pride, but to make sure no one else would have to fight the same small war for dignity in their own driveway, because sometimes the most important battles aren't the loud ones, but the ones won with quiet strength, unwavering, resolve, and a laminated ID card that makes the worst kind of people realize they picked the wrong person to underestimate. But even after Brian resigned, even after the flag was raised and the meetings became friendly, potlucks instead of power struggles, my wife and I knew the damage people like Karen and Brian had caused wasn't limited to forms and fines. It lingered in the tension some neighbors still carried in their shoulders, the way certain residents still looked over their shoulders before speaking, like years of intimidation couldn't be erased by one vote or one meeting. The truth is, restoring peace isn't about removing the loudest voice. It's about restoring confidence in the quiet ones. And that meant continuing to show up, continuing to lead by example, not with a badge or a title.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Continuing to lead by example, not with a badge or a title, but with presence, mowing the lawn side by side, helping the older couple 2 doors down when their water heater broke, joining the Halloween committee just to make sure no one was left out of the decorations list, things we never thought we'd care about, but now felt like acts of reclamation, taking back what had been slowly, silently poisoned by control-freak politics disguised as neighborly concern. And maybe the most important change didn't even happen in public. Maybe it was the day a young girl from 4 houses down, probably no more than 10, knocked on our door with a school project in her hand and asked if my wife would come to speak at her class about what a real hero looks like. And when she asked if she could hold the military ID just once, my wife knelt, quote, down, handed it to her, and said, "This is just a card. What matters is what you do with the responsibility it carries." And I saw in that moment the kind of legacy she was leaving without even trying, not through force, but through example. That's what Karen never understood. Power isn't about rules or fences or fines. It's about integrity. And when people witness it long enough, they stop being afraid and start acting brave themselves. The HLA restructured after all that the new president was elected by a transparent vote. Committees were opened to volunteers instead of being hand-picked, and my wife, much to her surprise, was asked to chair the Community Safety Board, not to patrol or to issue citations, but to ensure that no one in Ridgewood Hills ever felt afraid just for being who they were, especially not a veteran unloading groceries in her own driveway. She accepted on one condition: that the entire board undergo training on bias, neighbor conduct, and veteran reintegration, and to their credit, every single member showed up for it, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to unlearn the toxic habits that had gone unchecked for too long. And when the local news caught wind of it, a neighborhood that turned HOA chaos into genuine community reform, they sent a small crew to do a feature, and my wife stood there on camera, calm as always, saying, "We didn't come here to be a story. We came here to be neighbors." This just turned out to be part of that journey, and the anchor actually got choked up on air when describing what had happened. How a decorated soldier had been targeted by her own community, and had responded not with lawsuits or threats, but with grace, backbone, and steady, deliberate accountability. And when that story aired, the ripple spread further than we ever imagined. Letters from other military families poured in. Some who had gone through similar HOA battles, some who hadn't spoken out but now felt seen, felt empowered, and some who had been quietly thinking of giving up on their homes but now felt a reason to stay and fight CAR. For them again. And maybe that's what hit me hardest, realizing that our little street, our modest house, and the fight we never asked for had become something bigger than just Ridgewood Hills. But somewhere in another town, another veteran unpacking after deployment might not have to deal with a Karen or a Brian, because someone saw this story and decided to push back before things went too far. So, yes, the lawns stayed tidy, the mailboxes stayed standard, and the HOA meetings became just meetings again. But behind that normalcy was something stronger. Something that wouldn't be shaken so easily the next time someone tried to use rules to mask resentment or weaponize concern to disguise control. And my wife? She never changed her pace.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
And my wife? She never changed her pace, never let her armor slip. But every time a neighbor's kid waved at her from across the street, or a thank you card showed up in our mailbox addressed to the strongest woman on our block, I saw something in her eyes, not pride, not victory, but peace. The kind earned one choice at a time, by refusing to back down even when silence would have been easier. And for me, I just kept walking beside her, hand in hand, knowing full well we'd never truly be free of people like Karen, but now, because of her, those people would think twice before crossing that line again, and even if they did, they'd find out the hard way that military ID don't just open bases, they open eyes.